So, after 4 years and many judicial scandals, Donald Trump is back. Last week, Donald Trump won the U.S. general election. He won the popular vote, the Electoral College, and he led the Republicans to win a majority in the House and the Senate. This was one of the largest victories that the Republican Party had in the U.S. for quite some time now. So having Donald Trump back in the White House is raising the question of what the U.S. foreign policy is going to look like in different parts of the world. We know that during this campaign, he mentioned the case of the war in Ukraine, the case of the war in Gaza, the genocide in Gaza. We also know that he said that he doesn't want war. He wants to stop wars. He doesn't want to extend U.S. Military presence in different parts of the world. He wants war to stop in different parts, in different places. We know that he was not a big fan of NATO and for a few years back. So we all know that when it comes to those regions, but we're still going to have to see how those different policies are going to look like in different parts of the world. The question of the security in Southeast Asia for countries like Philippines, Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, in the crisis with China, how's going to happen. We know that for Latin America, it's likely to be under the border issue that has been a big part of the campaign in the US. But when it comes to Africa, we don't really have clarity on what and how his foreign policy is going to look like, because there was never been any mention about the continent during this campaign, not only from him, but also from Kamala Harris. From Kamala Harris, the assumption was the fact that since she was the Democrat candidate, if she won, she was likely to continue with the current Biden Africa policy toward Africa. But from Trump, we really don't know much. Trump, the one who called Africa shithole countries, is going to have to look on what the U.S. foreign policy in Africa is going to look like in the next 4 years. So, my name is Geraud Neema. I'm the Africa editor of the China Global South, a media that covers China's engagement in the Global South, Latin America, Africa, Middle East. In this series of show called the China and Africa Debate, we look into China engagement in Africa. We pay attention on different dynamics that happen on the continent. We talk about different issues. And if you have time, take the time to look into the different videos that we produce under the China and Africa Debate to understand the kind of content we produce here. But on this channel, we also produce all different kind of content. Our podcast, the China and Africa podcast, the China and the Global South podcast, the Afrique Chine podcast in French. We produce a wide range of content in these channels that covers all those issues related to China engagement in the Global South. So if you'd like to know more and to be updated about everything that we do, click the subscribe button and the notification bell. So every time we drop a new content, you are notified about what's going to come on our channel. So let's look into what the U.S. foreign policy in Africa is going to be under Donald Trump for the next 4 years to come. One of the main elements of Donald Trump foreign policy that we know, it's a very anti-China feeling. And we also know that during his first term, U.S. engagement in Africa was framed under that perspective of countering China and Russia's presence in Africa. And for example, that led to the instance of DFC and other institutions to really try to find the way to counter China's presence on the continent. Donald Trump's feelings toward China, they haven't changed. We know that he's still anti-China. We know he's still hell-bent on protecting U.S. industries. He's hell-bent on putting taxes that are likely to impact Chinese EVs and all the other product that's coming from China to protect U.S. market. That same feeling, it's likely to bleed out into U.S.-Africa relation, where it's going to remain under the spectrum of how to counter China and Russia's presence in Africa. This is the main framework. In terms of approach, We should not be expecting U.S. foreign policy to be toward Africa as a whole, but it's going to be targeted toward few specific countries. We should be expecting countries that are natural resource rich because those countries are important for the U.S. national security interests, which is going to be one of the other element of U.S. engagement with Africa. We should be expecting countries that are geographically well positioned, countries that are important by the economic size and where they are located for U.S. national security policies, because this is going to be the main framework of Donald Trump administration engagement with Africa. It's not going to be a value-driven diplomacy that we've seen under Joe Biden, which means, for instance, that we should not be expecting to see any AGOA weaponization based on the LGBTQ laws that has been passed in Uganda or in Ghana or elsewhere in Africa. So this not going to be one part of U.S. engagement under Trump in Africa. It's going really to be relying on national security interests. So countries with specific interests and specific value to the U.S. to U.S. national interest in Africa are going to be at the center of U.S. engagement in Africa. So having that, we know that we move from the whole approach, the global approach, we're going a specific approach, which means that there will be handful numbers of countries that fit the profile that I've mentioned before. So country like South Africa being the first powerhouse on the continent, economically and military, very important. We should be expecting like country like in Angola, country like the Angola, which has been under Joe Biden, one of the main countries leading and the U.S. strategic to counter China in Africa. We should also expect that the country like the DRC, rich of natural resources, to be one of the main focus of Donald Trump engagement. The U.S. administration in Africa, in West Africa, with the base closing closed in Niger, we know that Africa was looking into finding another country where they can put those that base in the Horn of Africa, country like Somaliland, Somalia, and Kenya. Those are the few of the issues that's going to remain at the center of U.S. engagement on the continent. So what does it mean for those countries in terms of U.S. engagement? We know that South Africa has been under heavy criticism under the Biden administration because of its connection with the BRICS, with how it cozy up with China, how it cozy up with Russia, and how it went into the ICC accusing Israel for war crime in Gaza. So we know that it made lots of people unhappy on both sides, Democrats and Republicans in the US. They were really not happy about South Africa. So having a Donald Trump being a anti-China, but not necessarily an anti-Putin, and also wanting to be strong on those countering China, being strong and countering China in Africa, we may find ourselves in a situation where South Africa is gonna be under even heavier attack from the Trump administration. However, let's not lose sight to the fact that South Africa has the former Foreign Affairs Minister Naledi Pandor reminded the U.S. A few months back that the South Africa is producing 15 of the main minerals that the U.S. automobile industry are needed of. So South Africa is not as weak as we could expect. So having that in mind, we may find ourselves in a situation where, tycoon from the automobile industry trying to ease the tension between the US and South Africa. So all those dynamics we're going to have to look into how it's going to play in South Africa. Country like Angola and DRC, Angola being at the heart of countering China in Africa with the Lobito Corridor project, a Lobito Corridor project that has different components: national security, investment, business, and trade. All of that, we should be expecting that the national security element is going to be the one really maintaining that project and the radar in Washington, D.C. So I'm expecting maybe less money, but a lot of more engagement, especially if and when we do have individuals within the Trump administration that's going to drive those the U.S. foreign policy. Why am I mentioning individuals? Is because since himself, it didn't never showed any specific or strong interest about the continent. It means that at the White House we might have a vacuum of interest around what's happening in Africa, which also means that we're going to have a U.S. foreign policy on Africa led by expert or individual within the State Department or within think tank organization or within lobby that really have those who are really have interest in Africa. Those people are likely to be powerful in that regard. And one of those people is a person like Peter J. Pham, who's been a former U.S. special envoy in Great Lake Africa, a guy who really hates China. I mean, he's making no secret about his aversion to China. He really hates China. So having an individual like him on one hand and having the background of the anti-China friend policy of what could be the Donald Trump foreign policy in Africa is going to create a combo where countering China in countries like the DRC, the Angola, Zambia is going really to be at the crust of that U.S. foreign policy in those countries. So when you have a person like him, Peter Pham, who's been different rumors heard in Washington, and when we see even social media, he might become the next assistant secretary for Africa in the State Department. Having a person like him at the helm of the U.S. Africa diplomacy it's likely to bring back not bring back, they're already there, but really to reinforce those strong geopolitical tension that we see happening on the continent. Those geopolitical tensions might be bad for the continent in so many levels, and specific for countries like the DRC and Angola, because we have now discussions of changing constitution in the DRC, where President Tshisekedi wants to modify the constitutions and say he didn't say that, but wants to say that he wants to write in new constitutions that fits our reality in DRC, which means that with the new constitutions, he may stay in power more than the current 2 terms limits that are in place. We have the same debate not yet happening, but that may happen in Angola, whereby I think by 2027, João Lourenço should have a new election and a new president should be elected. But we don't know if he wants to remain in power or if he wants to change the constitutions or not. So if we do find ourselves in a situation where those 2 head of states say, we're gonna play the U.S. anti-China card, we're gonna be anti-China, we're gonna side with you, we may find ourselves in situation where the U.S. is just gonna turn a blind eye on those situations. And let's not forget, Donald Trump has said that so many times. He prefers strong men that can control the countries, when he was mentioning Gaddafi, Saddam Hussein, and all of that. So having those situations, it's possible that those 2 head of states say, you know what, we're gonna side with the U.S. against China in exchange for you to support us. We can keep our country whole together. We're gonna have access to natural resources. So all of that can really become bargaining chip against bad governance happening in a country like in DRC or in Angola. Let's not forget that Donald Trump is very transactional in its approach with the continent. So those kind of diplomatic transactions can take place, and that could be bad for the countries, but good for the regime in places. So when we have all of that on the table, now the question is, what's going to happen? As I said earlier, countries, it's not going to be about the Africa as a whole. It's going to be about specific countries. And a very interesting story is that the Africa Report wrote about how now many Africa head of state have been reaching out to lobbyists in Washington, D.C., lobbyists that are around the Republican Party, Trump administration, to say, put a word for us because we want to remain relevant in the next Trump administration and its agenda for Africa. So because this is the way things are going to happen for most of the time, because when you have someone who doesn't have a very strong Africa interest or background, it means that experts and diplomats and lobbyists are going to be very much key on how you engage with the administration, how you get the administration to move forward or to put an agenda forward. So that's why many head of state now are reaching out to lobbyists in K Street in Washington, D.C. So this is basically what we should be expecting to happen in the next 4 years with the Trump administration, a return of a strong anti-China rhetoric. I'm just hoping that we're not going to see whole narrative like the dead threat narrative that has been debunked so many times. We should be expecting a bilateral, much more bilateral engagement. It means that country to country basis, country gonna have to prove the value and importance to the U.S. national security interest to remain relevant for U.S. foreign policy under Donald Trump. We should be expecting a lot of geopolitics being part of the narrative, being part of the engagement of the U.S. administration in Africa. We should also, I think we should also be mindful of the uncertainty we're gonna be heading to under the current under the next Trump administration, because as I said, he didn't mention much Africa didn't much Africa at all during his campaign. So we don't know how things are going to unfold into the future. So to finish this, just one word for African head of states: uncertainties are coming ahead. We don't know what to expect. We don't know what's going to happen. So we better get our cards right. We better know what we want to get from the US in the next coming years. We have to know what's the clarity of our foreign policy and our strategy to be able to engage in a better way, in much more constructive way. And I do believe this is why Kenyan former Prime Minister Raila Odinga, who's also candidate for Africa Union chairman position, as said recently, if Donald Trump doesn't want to engage with Africa, Africa has many friends. I think is just foreseeing a situation where the White House doesn't really pay attention to what's happening in Africa, not really giving much of an interest. Personally, I don't mind. I do believe that less U.S. engagement with the continent is always good for Africa to find a way and its own and ability to really move forward itself. And I think I've mentioned that a few months back during that trip in Washington, D.C. I was mentioning the fact that there's no clarity, even under the current Biden administration. There's no clarity about what a U.S. Africa relation should look like, a positive U.S. Africa relation should look like. The reality is only few countries can really matters for the U.S. For U.S. engagement in Africa. Country like South Africa, country like Egypt, but not many of African countries. So there's not as if we're gonna be losing or winning anything. Personally, I do believe we're gonna be, it's just gonna be business as usual. But less interest, of course. And one other thing to see during this foreign policy: less value-driven diplomacy, a much more transactional diplomacy toward the continent, and where many African countries have been complaining about how the U.S. administration would weaponize AGOA under the LGBTQ law to try to force countries like Ghana or Uganda to do things. And under Trump, it's unlikely to happen. So many on the continent will be happy about that. And I think on the low key, I think that was one of the reasons that many Africans, I think some journalists mentioned it, many Africans were quote unquote supporting or rooting for Trump. So I think it's because of those and that debate. But either way, we are heading toward, as I said, very uncertain times, and it's going to be really important for people like us, expert analysts, journalists. It's going to be, I think we're going to have a lot of fun because they're going to have a lot of engagement, a lot of debate that's going to happen, a lot of, I don't know, geopolitical debate and engagement that may arise from the U.S. attempts and U.S. agenda to counter China in Africa, because I believe that's going to be at the heart of U.S. engagement on the continent. What does it mean for what does it mean for China in the continent elsewhere? I think China in different parts of the continent is going to have much more free hands to expand its influence, much more liberty to even grow its influence in different countries. Small countries, mid-sized countries are going to benefit a lot from much more Chinese engagement in those countries, as long as those countries are not as important for U.S. national security interests in Africa. Either way, I'm going to stop here. So, as I was saying earlier, my name is Geraud Neema, the Africa editor of the China Global South Project, and it was my pleasure to bring you today the China in Africa debate. See you next time for another episode of this China in Africa debate.